Hey, what's up, Liron here. Today we're gonna paint together these birthday balloons in watercolor. But before that, I have a quick announcement to make. My How to Simplify course is now out on Udemy, part 1, part 2. I'm gonna link them both down below, so if you wanna binge watch the whole thing, you feel free to. You don't have to wait for the weekly releases. I do know many people prefer those, so if that's you, don't worry, no worries, keep watching it here on YouTube. One thing I will ask, if you're taking the course on Udemy, I would really appreciate if after you watch it, you leave a review and a rating. It really helps the course reach more people. So thank you so much for that. Now let's get into today's video. It's going to be a very straightforward process of painting, which is what I love about this. You will have a high quality picture of the drawing stage. You'll know exactly what to paint every stage of the way. And if you just follow the process, hopefully you will get a beautiful result. So let's get to it. So before we get started with the process, I just want to say I'm going to link down below a bunch of resources I made for you that show the line work in the first wash, just the first wash. I want you to know exactly what to paint at this stage, okay? So what I want you to do is grab one of those pictures that is most comfortable for you to work with, and then I want you to see where I put the first wash and do it just like I have. That'll be, I think, the best way to approach this. I really want this to be an organized process for you. Now, in case you missed it, I did mention the color in the bottom right corner. I believe it's Coal Black. It's by Paul Rubens, and it's a brand I really enjoy using. This is a pigment PBK7. Okay, so just wanted to mention that because I know every time people ask about what pigment I use. So let's talk about the strategy. What I'm doing right now is basically looking at these two balloons, and I'm figuring out where do I paint in order to cover everything but the highlights. So what are the highlights? Let's define that for a moment. If you look at the balloons, you see that there are areas that are almost white. You can say they're almost as white as the wall to the left. These are areas that I'm going to leave as highlights. And what I'm doing now is just painting around those. Okay, that's it for this wash. I know it may seem like a complex wash. It may seem very challenging. Trust me, this is all there is to it. It's just like working in a coloring book in a way. Most of my processes aren't like that, and I know some people don't like that. So this is why usually I like to really explain the logic behind it and the mindset I have in order to know what to paint. But in this example, I wanted to give you something that's a little more ready to go, that you can paint with me and really recreate. You can pause this video, grab again the photo, look at exactly where I drew the lines and redraw them and follow my model and get the same result, okay? Now, one thing I do here, which is highly optional, is look at where I'm at with the balloon. It looks like the shadow, the area that is colored, gets a little darker there, okay, actually close to the darkest dark. So I'm darkening it ever so slightly. This isn't the final dark, because my goal here again is to create a wash that's relatively flat and just fills in everything that's not a highlight. But I did go just a little darker. What this will allow me is to get a gradual transition in some places. Later on, once this dries, you'll see that I get obviously hard edges where I'm going to put in the shadows. But now I have the opportunity, while the edge is still wet, while I'm still painting it, to transition to a darker value and get that same gradual transition right now. It's optional. You don't have to do it now. There are ways of doing it later, and you will see them. But for now, this is what we do. Now, I do want to give you a couple of other words about this process, and I'm going to show you everything real time. Again, except for the drawing stage, which I skipped because you can get the resource and trace. Like, I really encourage you to just trace, draw it exactly as I have, and paint it exactly as I am now. I do want to talk a bit about strategy. So now we're covering everything but the highlights, as I mentioned a few times. The next stage is going to be recognizing those darker areas and darkening them, and then we'll add the shadows on the walls in the background. Now, the reason I start with the balloons in this example is obviously they're the main subject of this painting, and it's easy to paint within those shapes that are relatively small, and we don't have to concern ourselves with the surrounding, with the walls. Is there a more graceful way to combine everything into one wash at this stage already? Yes, but I want to keep the process relatively simple, so I will not be doing that here. Okay, now I'm starting on with number 3. These are birthday balloons again, obviously. It's not my 23rd birthday. I'm a little older than that, but I just saw this picture and I just wanted to take it very spontaneously, and I thought it would be a good tutorial for you. Now I want you to observe something important here. I'm starting with the 3. Now look at this edge. This is the very minimal technique involved here. I'm using a bit of a wet brush to move the paint a bit, spread it out, make it lighter, and you will see me come back in just a moment with a smaller brush and blend that edge there. There isn't a lot of technique to this process. It's, as I mentioned, like a coloring book. I tell you what areas to fill in, you fill them in. But in some places, I do see that there is a gradual transition from white, aka highlight, to this mid value. So I do want to do that in some of these areas, and you'd be surprised at how big of an impact just doing it in 1 or 2 spots can have on the overall composition and feeling of flow and feeling like this is actually watercolor. Okay? Now look at the small highlights I'm leaving. These are all important. They tell the story of the balloons, and this is a very beloved subject for many, because the beautiful thing about balloons is they're filled with abstract shapes that you can actually recognize very easily. Here's the thing, when you're painting people or animals or things with nuanced light and shadow that you're very familiar with, it's very hard to imagine the nose as a combination of multiple abstract shapes. But here with these balloons, it's actually quite simple. Just look at it's all abstract. You get a bunch of triangular shapes, you get a bunch of beautiful, and when I say shapes, it's either dark on light or light on dark, very dark on medium, very dark on light. This pattern of the balloons with all of its creases and folds creates a beautiful high contrast clear impression. Here I am blending another edge, by the way, and this clear impression is what makes these such a beloved painting subject. When you have these strong contrasts of this chromatic reflective surface of the balloons, it's something that is very easy to create as a painting. It's very, it almost invites you to paint it due to its nature. The shapes and these sharp transitions and sharp corners within the shapes, they're all very inviting. They're also very forgiving. So even if you draw it based on my drawing and you kind of mess it up here and there, even though I'm giving you the roadmap, you don't have to think too much. But even if you mess it up, mistakes happen always. Even in that case, it's very forgiving. It will still look beautiful and shiny and chromatic, and it's just such a fun thing to paint, in my opinion. Again, this high contrast, the fact that it's monochrome, it's just grays. I'm using just this coal black, nothing else. Pigment black 7, the only pigment I use, and you can use whatever you want. You can use sepia or like a violet, or just do it monochromatically. It's a good practice for recognizing the values and really nailing them down. And the technique is also quite simple. Again, you're just painting within the shapes. For some areas, yes, there is a little blending, there is a little bit of thought involved and experience, but for the most part, just get the right value in the right place and you're done. Now, I do want to say a word or two about the consistency of paint I'm using right now. I'm using a medium to light wash. And by the way, I'm blending an edge here that started to dry, because look at the photo. It feels like it's not as sharp as it was, so I'm kind of loosening it up a bit. And here we go up close. This wash, it's not tea. It's not what many would call tea, that is very, very, very light. It's somewhere in the middle, so it's kind of, it moves on the palette, but not much, okay? And that's the key. You want a good flow that will make it easier to paint the first wash, make it very flowy, but you also want enough so that you don't have to go over it again. And the value I got here, I don't have to really go over it again as much, maybe in just a few spots. So now we're off to the second stage. Now the resource hopefully helped you get the first wash in the right places. Now this is kind of a supplement. This will bring out some areas where less light can reach. In this stage, to be honest with you, is simpler. You have smaller shapes to worry about. You don't have to worry that much about flow or getting things to flow evenly because it's smaller shapes. This is very similar to drawing. But the beautiful part is, even if you're having, let's say you're having trouble with drawing, here you don't really have to know where to put everything. It's very clear. We already have the drawing and the first wash. So it's fairly straightforward. This top edge is something I do want to blend, so I'm just coming back with a bit of water, helping it move around. This is a technique you'll have to practice. Just practice it enough times and you will get it eventually. When you place water next to a slightly darker paint, it blends the edge in a beautiful way. Now look at how I'm leaving a gap to the right and also in the middle of this dark shape, because these areas just aren't as dark. So really follow the shapes you see. And if you followed my roadmap in the resources I attached in the description box, you will really have a much easier time of knowing where to place everything in this stage. Now, I have to be frank with you here. I'm not creating the value exactly as I see it. If you look at the darkest darks in the balloons, they're actually divided into maybe 2 or 3 groups. There are the black, like fully dark black values, and then you have the dark values that aren't fully black. I'm kind of merging them into one. I'm not really that concerned about the nuance within them, because it's just good enough for the result I want. I don't need that extra nuance. Like, look at the area I fill in right now. The top is dark, and then the bottom of it is just a little lighter. So if I wanted to get it exactly right, I would come back with a bit of water, help the paint move. I don't need to. I just fill in the whole thing just with black paint, because it will look good enough. You will see. Once we add the background, for sure, it will look much, much better. And you also want to think about what you're painting. Like in this example, all of these beautiful patterns, it's not just a clean transition from light to dark. You have the edges of the shapes be very zigzaggy and triangular and sharp. And that happens due to the nature of the material. When this plasticky material creases or bends, or maybe it's kind of a paper plastic, I don't know what it is, like a nylon, when it creases, it creates these beautiful patterns where the material changes direction when it wraps around the puffiness of the letters, which is why you get this beautiful pattern of triangles and whatnot. It's just really fun to look at, which is why, again, this is such a popular subject. You'll often see people working in colored pencils on these kinds of paintings. And I want to add another bit of advice there. Go as realistic as you want. You don't have to follow my roadmap. You can take my photo, which I obviously will attach to, and like blow it up really big and actually paint all of the small details, draw all of the small details, have them as accurate as you can, and then work in small sections to get them to look right when looking from afar. You can do that. Sorry, you can follow it more closely. You can go more realistic than I have. I believe I went for a level of realism that is very satisfying to the eye, and not much is necessary more than that. Here you see I make the separation between the black and the kind of dark that I got left from the previous wash. But yeah, another thing to take into consideration is the size of the painting. So you can kind of figure out the size I'm using. It's about maybe 9 inches or 7 by 7, 9 by 9, something like this, 10 by 10, 11 by 11. I'm not sure, something in that ballpark. If you work smaller than that, you may have a hard time getting in all the details I have. So if you're gonna work smaller, that's fine. Just you'll need to kind of reduce some of the details. Now, if you want to work larger, I would suggest, I think my amount of details will be enough, but you could go even more detailed. But you have to understand the size does dictate to some extent, and by the way, this is too dark, but that's okay. The size does dictate to some extent how many details you'll need. Okay, so it's another thing to have in mind. If you want to change the size here, you may find yourself adding details or removing details, and it's a good practice to do both a smaller simplified painting as well as a larger one. I tend for YouTube videos to choose things that are a little more manageable, that won't turn out to be very, very long tutorials, because that's just logistically it's not as comfortable, long editing times, long upload times, but that's just me. Again, if you're just painting for yourself, go for it. Like, do large pieces that take a week. Take your time with them. I do believe that quality goes above quantity in some cases, so you may prefer to work on one really big piece that you're dedicated to, as opposed to many small ones. To me, it's just about the mood, as I mentioned in a recent video. But yeah, the consistency I'm using now, you see it moves between kind of very thick to kind of flowy. but not very flowy. If I move the palette, the paint's not going to move a lot there. Now I finished with the main bulk of the dark shapes, the larger ones. Now what I'm doing is kind of finishing touches. And you'll notice I kind of darkened some parts a little more than they actually were. That's fine. Some inaccuracies here and there, that's okay. But you'll notice there are a lot of small details I kind of neglected or didn't notice, and these are the ones I'm working on right now. So just to get those smaller nuances of the shapes around the balloons, like you'll see up top, on the edges, because it's actually it's glued together in the edges, or I don't know how they do that kind of a thing, but they connect basically two sides of that material and they kind of sew it around. So that's where you're gonna get some direction changes, which lead to some darker, here, exactly where I'm working right now, some darker edges there. Darker and lighter, by the way. Some of them are lighter than the walls in the background even. But also on top of the three, you will see this, and it's a beautiful wavy pattern because of the shape of the material, again. And every material is going to have different properties, different ways of reflecting the light. These are very chromatic, again, they're very glossy. It's not a matte. A similar thing happens with painting glass or plastic, like transparent materials. It's going to have a very similar pattern. It may be reversed in some cases if it's a reflective surface, but the principle is the same. You'll get a lot of sharp transitions from light to dark, aka high contrasts. Now here's where technique does become involved. That's the first technique, really, almost, with wet and wet. So what I'm doing is pre-wetting this area around the two, because I want to get a gradual transition for the shadow that it casts on the wall. So first I'm pre-wetting, going outside of the area that's going to be dark, a little outside so that I have room for movement, and then I'm coming back with paint. It's kind of a light to mid value here. So not tea, again, not completely transparent, just a bit darker than that, yeah. And I'm putting it in, and it moves, and it creates this beautiful blended edge. So you will actually see two techniques for creating soft edges here, which I talk about a lot in all of my videos. One was pre-wetting, as you saw. I pre-wet the area, then did wet and wet. The other one, which I'm doing right now, is first I'm painting the shape, and then I'm going over, you will see, I'll go over its edges and make them blended. Okay, so there are a lot of ways of approaching this, obviously. I wanted to show you two. Not to say that I used them, that there was some kind of a logic behind me using this one or that one in this specific regard. The one thing I'll take into consideration is if it's a smaller shape, it may be easier to first pre-wet and then put in that small shape. And if it's a larger shape, then maybe it makes more sense to first paint it and blend the edges. The smaller the shape is, the more important the edge becomes, because it's just the edge takes up a lot of space compared to the shape itself. And what happens is it's easier to get that control actually maybe counterintuitively when you first wet the area and then you put in the paint. Whereas what I'm doing right now of filling in the shape, I have to worry about whether it dries or not. And as you will see, I will have a few bloopers here and there. You see I'm painting the shape of the shadow, and I have to work fast before the edge dries, and then come back and blend the edge before it dries again. And then maybe the paint will move all the way to where it goes from wet to dry, and then I'll have to refresh the edge. Maybe it will become a hard edge again, even if I don't want it to. So yeah, both these techniques have their uses. Generally speaking, if you're working a very large area, I'd much rather to first paint the area and blend the edges, whereas if you're working a very tiny shape that needs to still have blended edges, I'd first pre-wet. And a good example for this is, imagine you're drawing a soft transition between sky and sea. So the logical step would be obviously to paint well, that's at least for me, I don't know, maybe you're different. I would much prefer work top to bottom, paint the sky, and then switch to either blend the sky into the ocean or switch to a different color and blend it that way, or a different value. Whereas if I'm working on a very small shadow under the nose, I think it would be wiser in many cases to pre-wet it and then put it in. Because if you first put in a small shape. Once you try blending the edges, you may lose the shape in its entirety. So just another consideration. Now look at these shadows. They're actually quite important because it's the shadows these small wires or ribbons cast on the wall. You see the ribbons are tied to the bottom of the balloons, and then they cast this beautiful shadow on the wall. You want to get that right. Now here I kind of got to where I started overworking it. I'm like, oh, that's way too dark. Let me fix that, when I should have probably just left it as is. So I came back with the brush, tried lifting a bit. I came back with a tissue, tried lifting a bit. Came back with some wet paint when it started drying. This is not wet enough to do wet and wet, especially not if I'm using this wet of a wash. I should have come back with really dark paint. Sometimes you have these brain farts, as you'd call them, and you do something you shouldn't have. Here I'm picking it up, and then I'm like, oh, it's terrible. It's not, it's like really, it takes away attention from the balloons. So I'm coming back with some darker paint once again. Kind of messed some parts of it up, but not too bad, to be honest with you. That's perfectly fine. That's okay. It's definitely not the end of the world. You will see once it dries, it becomes much less significant. I'm just going to dab the edge a bit. Now I'm going to add the wall. And this is going to be very simple, okay? So I'm adding the line where the wall is, and I'm just filling in the area to the right with flat, thin wash. This is more like tea, okay? So this is tea consistency, and you'll see once I spread out the shape, it's lighter than what I initially started working on with the balloons in the first wash, okay? This is just tea. The reason why is I want to take the wall just a tint darker, but very gently, and again, remember what happens when we glaze over existing darker values. We have to work very fast and not scratch the paper too much, not mess around with it too much, because we're always at risk of reawakening what's underneath it. So I'm just going over it once, quickly and efficiently. This is where doing brush control exercises can really work and benefit your technique. Learn how to put the shapes in effectively, without too much hassle, without too much, dealing basically damage to what was underneath. And I'm just stopping where the wall is. So you see right here, very light tea kind of a wash, just to get some kind of a separation between the wall on the right and on the left. A direction change means that the value is different. And with that, we're actually really close to finishing this one up. I'm going to give you soon a view of the final result. I'm just going to sign this one first. Add a few small details, by the way. You see these ribbons? They needed a bit more definition, so I just went over them. Arguably, I could add more definition to the shadows on the walls, but I figured it looks good. So here's the final result. I hope you enjoyed this one, and now we can wrap it up. So thank you so much once again for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new and was able to produce something out of it. And if you just watched it for fun and you're going to paint based on it later, I really believe this is a good one because you can actually draw the shapes of light and shadow and then just go ahead and paint within those shapes. And it's fairly a simplistic process of just leaving the highlights and then going for the darks. And again, I included the pictures of everything, all of the stages, high quality. You can trace them, you can do them, whatever you want, recreate my drawing exactly one to one, and that's that. So thank you for that. Now I do want to remind you, my course, How to Simplify, is out now on Udemy too. If you want to binge watch the whole thing, I divided it into 2 parts. I will put the links in the description box below. And if you enjoy it, please leave a review and a comment if you can, or a rating for the course on Udemy. It helps it reach more people and it helps them find my other courses. Thank you so much. I will see you again in the next vid.